That's right, Jude, and in fact, to decode what's really happened over the past couple of hours, particularly with respect to this cabinet briefing. In fact, I'm now joined by Madhav Narayan. He's a senior journalist. Joining Mr. Narayan is Shivesh Pratap. He's a political analyst. Thank you very much to the two of you for taking the time out and being with us here on ET. Now, to you, Mr. Narayan, first, of course, we were anticipating some announcement, some sort of an announcement over a paper leak bill with stricter measures. But if you saw the press conference that just happened recently after the cabinet, there was no mention of such a bill. What, in your understanding, has happened? Has there been any action with respect to the approval of that bill is concerned? And if it has happened, then why is the government not talking about it or addressing it?
Sumita, hi. Thank you for having me. I think it's important to understand that, first of all, there is a gridlock. There is a logjam because the protesters of the CJP are essentially demanding the resignation of Dharmendra Pradhan, which they call the education minister, which they call as non-negotiable. That itself is an intractable solution. The other thing is that the Prime Minister has talked about a fast-track courts to stop paper leaks, and although there was, from what I could understand, there was no mention of it in the press conference. In some details emerging from certain news channels suggest that there will be a 3-month deadline or something like that. But it doesn't address the core issue of what happens to the students who suffer from such paper leaks, because it's important to understand the context. You know, actually the international media seems to have covered this better than the domestic media, because they seem to understand the pressures the Indian students are in, because it is unusual. There's no other country in the world where this goes through. Your entire life or career choices are often defined by one examination, not even 3. Even T20 cricket matches and one-day matches have 4 or 5 or 3 matches. So this doesn't have series. Then a lot of it is dependent on one written examination. And when that suffers, there is the stress level of somebody who's prepared for years is very high. So I think that has to be addressed. I think politically speaking, I saw an article by Sonia Gandhi of Congress today in The Hindu, which covers a lot of ground on this. Of course, it is in some way political, but I found at least 8 out of 10 points she mentions are non-political. Some of them may be involving public education, that we can take them out. But still, there are issues related to why this kind of examination system we have. So that kind of reform has to go beyond fast-track courts on paper leaks. So there has to be a deeper thinking on the issue. As far as leaks are concerned, you know, this time, I believe from what reports are suggesting is there is a provision for compensation of that today's talks between the CJP leaders and the government has on the students who suffered or committed suicide. But I think we need since there are literally tens of millions of young Indians involved in this, there has to be a broad-based educational reform using this as an opportunity so that, you know, to make it less political and more oriented towards the youth and the future of the country. And as far as this particular decision is concerned, it's a welcome step, of course. Any step that improves the situation and punishes uses punishment as a deterrent is welcome. But please understand, this is not essentially a law and order problem. This is not about a police. Right. It's not a criminal problem. It's not a crime problem. It's a socio-economic problem at some level.
Right.
That application of mind has to be there, and so that petty politics is kept out of this. And,
absolutely.
So that has to be done, and I see no such signs. Forget about Dharmendra Pradhan. We still, you know, we can call this an unreasonable decision because either way, because replacing X with Y is not going to change some of the issues. But you cannot use that to avoid accountability. Accountability is another thing.
In fact, Madhav, I'm glad you bring up those points. I'm glad you bring up those points because, in fact, I just want to go off on what you just said a little while about there being a gridlock. And if I could bring Shivesh into the discussion here. Now, essentially, with the Prime Minister's midnight message, so to speak, and, you know, Mr. Wangchuk ending his fast as well, the belief in good faith is that either way, the government will introduce legislation to counter paper leaks. And this ought to, in an ideal world at least, not have anything to do with the students continuing their strike, continuing their sit-in, continuing to demand the resignation of the education minister itself. So, Shivesh, should that be a move that the government makes in good faith, irrespective of whether or not the students decide to end their strike. If the Prime Minister has promised legislation, that legislation in all likelihood and in all logical reasoning should happen. Or correct me if I'm wrong, Shivesh.
So as we all have seen that in the night, Prime Minister came and in a very gingy way, he recorded his message from his mobile's front camera. So he himself said that paper leaks are not a trivial issue. And Modi government has already addressed this earlier as well. But the biggest question is that if we already have Public Examination Prevention of Unfair Means Act 2024, then also if we look back, we were not able to control these paper leaks. And when we talk about the Viksit Bharat dream, we have India have median age of 28 years. It means the half of the population is below 28 years, and they all have the aspiration to get a good job, good career. And when we talk about Viksit Bharat, we need to understand that this examination, these all entrance examination are not the subject of any law. But when we think about that, okay, now the cabinet has been approved certain things to tighter the rules or regulations, laws, and we will give the imprisonment of 10 years rather 5 years, or 10 crore rather 1 cr of the money penalty. That will not solve the problem. We would require to address the modus operandi at a larger scale, because this kind of paper leak issue is, as my colleague rightly said, that it's a socio-economic issue into the society, and students are subject to the each and every family. So if we can bring UPI in India, where we have the diversity at an economic scale, and we can solve that problem, which can be the example around the globe, why not we can solve the problem for these paper leaks? Because if we are implementing the digitalization, the other things also, we need to think rather addressing a fast track courts to give the imprisonment to all the culprits and everything. We need to think about the preventive mechanism, that these kind of issues should not happen into the society, because ultimately it impact to the families. Because these days you also know that the investment on education for an average family is like more than
Right.
30% of their annual salary, their investment. And because of that, this is a very
Absolutely.
sensitive case for the society and
That's
family.
right, Shivesh.
So I believe that we would require a bigger,
Absolutely,
more,
Shivesh.
the bigger solution, long-term perspective. We need to have something so
Absolutely.
that we
An
can prevent the.
overhaul of the education
Okay.
system is essentially what you have also stated, which Madhavan sir is also saying, that that is needed, an overhaul of the overall education system that we have in the country. In fact, paper leaks as a problem, as you may have also seen, is not only specific to this particular government, but this has been going on since decades, and it's high time that this is addressed. But Madhavan sir, just one final question before we let you go in. This is pertaining to the resignation of Dharmendra Pradhan. The students are asking for that. The opposition parties are also asking for that. But you are not sounding very convinced about that particular demand. Don't you think that that should also be addressed by the government, given the fact that it will help fix accountability? If it will not fix accountability, at least it will send out a message. So the optics of this particular move will send out a very strong message in the country.
I agree with you on that. You see, there is something called moral responsibility. This is a country in which Lal Bahadur Shastri resigned as a railway minister, which is considered a great precedent, which was rarely followed later when there was a railway accident. Now, the railway minister is not there at the signal causing that accident, but he says, look, this all happens under my oversight. Now, changing the education secretary means whatever happens, there is nothing political about it, only the bureaucracy is responsible. That is itself an irresponsible way of looking at it. Somebody in the political system has to take ownership. Just see what happened in the UK. They have changed the prime minister following controversies over the Epstein files and some other issues. So within the Labour Party, there has been a change. So we are following the same system. I think there has to be a sense of political accountability and portfolio-based approach. And I understand that this may not be the panacea for it, but you cannot use this as an excuse to avoid responsibility or accountability. Like you said, there is a case for a symbolic approach to the whole thing. We can set up a commission to reform education, at the same time change the minister, so that the message goes out, look, we are listening and we understand there is a serious issue that has to be resolved.
And even as we have this discussion itself, what we are picking up from the ground, in fact, my colleague Prakash has said that sources have in fact told ET Now that the Union Cabinet has approved a fast-track court provision and stringent punishment provisions to prevent paper leaks itself. The Cabinet has approved, sources say. Again, all of this is source-based information. With that caveat, what we are breaking right now is that the Cabinet has approved amendments to the Public Examinations Act of 2024. And these special fast-track courts that the Cabinet proposes to set up will be given enhanced legal powers, even as these courts will also be mandated to complete hearings and deliver verdicts within a period of 3 months. Again, all of this being source-based, since it is still a bill that is being deliberated on by Cabinet. That's what we're picking up from the ground. Shivesh, if I could get your take on this before we end. So it seems like the foundations for a solid piece of legislation are in place. It could well happen maybe next week when Parliament reconvenes. Some light at the end of the tunnel, at least in terms of there being ink on paper in terms of finding a solution to this. Of course, the resignation demand in all likelihood will remain, but some good news surely, Shivesh.
So I believe that, we should appreciate the education minister in a way also that, once this paper leaks happen, post that, they organize a re-examination for 22 lakh students. And on 19th July, the result has been declared without any, this kind of leak or any unpleasant situation. So I believe that this is a symbolic thing, that resignation of the education minister will solve the problem. But post that, if we want to have a permanent solution into the country, I think we should think more about this solution for the student, rather politicize the issue by the resignation of the education minister.
Right, Shivam, on that note, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and joining us here. And Madhavan sir, thank you very much once again for sharing your perspectives on all these developments that are currently happening as we speak. So